Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. When Rich told me about this series, it sounded very interesting, bringing people from all different areas together, but who all have population interests broadly defined. So I'm excited to be a part of that. The project that I'm going to talk about today, so when I asked Rich what should I talk about, what kinds of talks are you all interested in, he said something very fresh and new, not something that's been done or very polished or already been published or anything like that. So what I'm talking to you about today is very, very fresh, such that I was still running models on the plane. But it's part of a kind of a series of papers I'm doing. So before I start talking about this, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what this is following so that you can see where it is kind of in the progression. So this follows a paper that I just did on what I call the lingering effects of stigma. So if you are familiar with kind of theory on stigma, which some of we'll go through today, but theory on stigma talks a lot about how the effects of stigma impact people's lives, the outcomes, various outcomes of having a stigmatizing condition. One of the holes that I thought that stigma theory didn't address was, what about if you can exit a stigmatizing condition? What happens? So most stigma theory is based on things like mental illness, HIV, gay and lesbian, things that are permanent conditions, things that you can't lose. But when we think about something like obesity, that's a stigmatizing condition or a stigmatized status, but that you can exit. And so my question was, what happens to people in terms of, if they have experienced the stigma of being in that condition and then they leave that condition, do they still experience the stigma because it was such a part of their identity, or are they able to kind of, lose that part of their identity and recover from whatever ill effects they were having from the stigma? So that was the first study. So the first study we looked at teenage girls, it was the same sample. We looked at teenage girls who were obese, and we compared girls who started off the study, it's a longitudinal study, we compared girls who started obese and then lost weight to girls who were chronically obese and girls who were never obese on self-esteem. And what we found was that girls who were obese had lower self-esteem than normal weight girls, which was no big surprise. But what we found was that even on this trajectory of girls that lost weight over time, their self-esteem stayed low and their body image stayed low, such that we looked at a measure of self-perception, like how big do you think you are, how do you see yourself? And they continued to see themselves as fat even when they entered the normal weight range. So to me, that was evidence of that the effects of stigma linger even if you can exit the stigmatizing condition. So I thought that was very exciting. Then that led me to ask the next question, which is about, well, I'll start getting into it. The next question is about, it's still about kind of the lasting or lingering effects of stigma, but now I'm looking at not just if you exit the condition, what happens, but more taking a LifeCourse perspective or a developmental perspective and looking at, does it matter when the stigma occurs in your life in terms of lasting effects? Developmental theory and LifeCourse theory would argue, that there are critical times in people's lives when your identity is, kind of more ripe for formation. And so the question in this paper, the question in this analysis has more to do with when stigma occurs in terms of having lasting effects. Okay, so a few definitions, of course. Get a drink of water. Stigma theory. It goes all the way back to Durkheim and suicide, but most of when we start talking about stigma, everybody starts with Goffman in the 60s. So Goffman defines stigma as an attribute that is deeply discrediting and something that can reduce complete individuals to tainted, discounted ones. Jones et al. Went on from that and said it's a mark that defines individuals as flawed or spoiled. And then the last one I have up there is a feature that is associated with a devalued social identity within a social context. Goffman's was kind of more individualistic, and so as it's gone through history, people have tried to bring in social context more, that stigma isn't just an individual phenomenon, it's a group phenomenon. It has to do with social construction. So putting that together with the Lincoln-Phelan definition in 2001, which is kind of in sociology, the prevailing current definition is that a stigmatized group possesses an attribute or characteristic that's linked to a devalued social identity and is ascribed stereotypes or other deviant labels that increase vulnerability to status loss, unfair treatment, prejudice, and discrimination. Thing to note is that stigmatizing conditions are socially constructed and they change over time, and particularly obesity is a perfect example of that. That in different cultures, having a heavier body may be valued, and then in U.S. culture, having a thinner body may be valued. But even in U.S. culture, there's some subcultures that value a heavier body over a thinner body. This has changed throughout history. A lot of it's had to do with availability of food and poverty, and where being heavier indicated that you had money. So even obesity is a stigmatizing condition, but it's one that has a social context, and that has changed over time. So Lincoln-Phelan in 2001 proposed a very broad conceptualization of stigma, trying to bring together various definitions from various disciplines of stigma, and they proposed 5 interrelated components: labeling, stereotyping, separation, which is like the us from the them, reaction to stigma, and then discrimination. They emphasize stigma as a social process, and a process embedded within social cultural environment, but in whose results you can see in the individual. So it's a social process, but of course the results, the outcomes are within the person. So it's truly an interaction between the self and the other. Okay, so the part that I'm going to talk about today is the labeling part of that. We could talk about stereotyping, we could talk about discrimination. All of these things will have adverse outcomes on teenage girls, but the thing I'm interested in is the labeling. So labeling theory, Sheff, 1966. Key thing about labeling theory is that it supposes that these stereotypes, these attitudes that we have about these conditions, come from socialization processes early on. So the idea is that we are raised, in our environment to believe certain things about these stigmatized characteristics. So say mental illness, that's often used with stigma theory. A lot of it's based on mental illness, that we are raised in a certain way. We are raised in a culture that teaches us things about what it means to be mentally ill. So without even necessarily realizing it, we come up in an environment that has these attitudes about mental illness, and so we ourselves may have these attitudes about mental illness. These get reinforced over time through various interactions with people. So me, myself, I may not be mentally ill, but I'm raised with these attitudes about mental illness, and then if I get labeled with the mentally ill label, that flips a switch inside my head because I know what that means to be mentally ill, because I've been raised with those attitudes. And so if I become labeled with that label, mentally ill, then all of a sudden that means that I take on those stereotypes and they become me. So that's the idea with labeling theory, is that stigmatized people may experience changed self-perceptions once they are labeled, and that then they may integrate those stereotypes into their self and into their identity. Modified labeling theory, which is another link theory, takes that a step further to emphasize that when people internalize these devaluing messages, they live in the continued expectation of discrimination. And so the key here is that people don't actually have to be discriminated against to experience these identity changes. It's being raised with these attitudes, being socialized with these attitudes, getting the label, and then living in the expectation of that discrimination or the expectation of being treated poorly. So this is all anticipated. It doesn't require direct action by anybody else. All it requires is being labeled. And being labeled may mean, for the mentally ill person, it may mean going to a doctor's appointment and getting a diagnosis. Or being labeled may mean, for the fat girl, being called fat on the playground by a friend. So labeling can come from different places. It can be a very innocuous, I'm sorry to tell you you have schizophrenia, or it could be, kind of teasing, bullying kind of labeling as well. But what happens then is that the sense of self-worth is transgressed by this label. And so together with the anticipation of future bad treatment, knowing what these labels mean, knowing what is attached to this, setting people up for bad outcomes. Okay, so people are labeled with a condition or attribute that is discrediting. If the label becomes integrated into the identity, they may suffer adverse outcomes. This can be poor mental health, this can be decreased educational attainment, low self-esteem. There's, studies show that people with stigmatizing conditions can make less money, all kinds of different outcomes. Okay, but so what I'm looking at, so I'm interested in this modified labeling theory perspective, but what I would like to do is bring it together with some developmental and LifeCourse perspective. In such a way that developmental and LifeCourse theories would suggest that when in the LifeCourse this is experienced matters. That it's not just having the label, that it's at what point in your life you get this label, that will matter. Because from a developmental perspective, the identity is constantly changing over time. It's changing, and from the minute you're born until the minute you die, identity is changing throughout childhood, throughout adulthood. But in adolescence, in childhood and adolescence in particular, we undergo a lot of rapid changes. Particularly in adolescence. Adolescence is a time of rapid change, physically and emotionally. So when this happens, when this stigmatizing condition happens, and when the labeling happens, it may make a difference for the outcome. Not just the immediate outcome, but kind of the long-term outcome. So my idea is that if it happens at a particularly vulnerable point, if it happens, kind of at a developmentally critical period in terms of shaping the identity, that may have long-term outcomes, regardless of what happens in the future, regardless of what happens with being heavy in the future, or being labeled in the future, or being discriminated against in the future, that just experiencing that at a particular time developmentally may have a long-term effect. Oops. Okay, so I want to look at the timing in the process of stigma. When in the LifeCourse it is experienced may impact the extent to which it's internalized, and that then may impact the outcomes. Okay. So why study obesity? There's lots of stigmatizing conditions we can study. The reason why I'm studying obesity is that for children and adolescents, in the US at least, obesity has become one of the most stigmatized conditions. And since I'm interested in children and adolescents, this seemed like a perfect one to study. I don't think that the things that I'm talking about today are limited to obesity, though. I think we could talk about any stigmatizing condition in children and adolescents. Just so happens in the US context right now, obesity is huge. So in kids, this US Center for Disease Control and Prevention defines overweight and obese as being above the 85th and 95th body mass index percentiles, respectively. These are based on age and sex, so different numbers for boys and girls, and they vary by age. In children through age 19, between 2003 and 2006, 31.9% were at or above the 85th percentile, that means overweight. 16.3% were at or above the 95th percentile, that means obese, and 11.3% were at or above the 97th percentile, which is very obese. Everybody knows these days, because it's all over the press, that childhood obesity is linked with a ton of health problems, both physical health problems and mental health problems. We're seeing type 2 diabetes in children, high blood pressure in children, and then mental health problems like low self-esteem, among many others. Overweight and obese people in the US experience stigma. This is one of those things like smoking causes lung cancer. I could put up study after study after study and result after result after result. This is one of those things that I consider completely settled. In the US, overweight and obese people experience stigma. They experience stigma, they experience discrimination, they experience stereotyping and bias, and the whole package. Research suggests that overweight and obese youth are subjected to stereotyping, bias, and discrimination by friends, by family, by teachers, by parents. I could list you many studies that show, parents with one obese child and one not obese child tend to favor the not obese child, not just in terms of how they treat them, but even monetarily. There was a study done that showed they're less likely to send their obese children to college compared to their non-obese child. So it hits hard, it hits at home, and it's very pervasive. Because stigma is socially constructed and vary by context, though, the experience of stigma and the outcomes of stigma may vary by gender and by race and ethnicity. So by gender, in the US context, body image stuff, appearance-related things, weight-related things tend to more heavily impact females compared to males. And that's another one of those. Study after study after study shows that. There's tons of body of literature that shows that weight and appearance-related things tend to impact females more. And then in terms of looking at the outcomes of that, there's study after study that show that, that linking adolescent obesity to emotional harm and to emotional outcomes, whether long-term or just confined to adolescence. So because of that, because this process seems to be more detrimental for girls than for boys, this study is only looking at adolescent girls. And then race, and I know that this is one of those things that is probably different in the US than here, but in terms of race in the US, there's a very different kind of subcultural context in terms of body size and race, such that in the Black community or in Black communities, I don't want to be monolithic, but in Black communities, Black women tend to be more accepting of larger body size compared to white women. And so there's kind of a different culture surrounding body size among Black women than among white women in the US. Black women's studies have shown that they also tend to be more generous or less judgmental in their evaluations of obese people, and just generally more accepting of a range of body types. And then they also seem to suffer less of an emotional penalty due to heavy body mass. So for example, self-esteem. Black girls seem to be less, have less of a self-esteem impact for being obese compared to white girls. As to why these differences exist, a scholar named Lovejoy argued that to counteract their stigmatization in larger society, Black women may develop alternative standards for valuing their appearance and character. So basically, I'm not going to play by the same rules because we're already rejected. So because this may differ by gender and by race, I'm also looking at this in Black and white girls in the US. Okay. So the big outcomes that tend to be looked at with teenage girls in obesity are self-esteem and depression. The last study I did self-esteem, so this one I'm doing depression. This one also, because of the way it was measured, depression was more appropriate to answer this question. Okay, the findings on self-esteem are very, very consistent. The findings on self-esteem are, most studies show that at least in adolescent girls, obesity is associated with decreased self-esteem. Findings on depression are very mixed. And they're mixed for a lot of reasons. There's a great review by Wardle and Cook where they go through like every study that's been written on obesity and depression in adolescents. And compare, which measures they used and what samples they used, and, to potentially try to understand why the findings have been different, because they really have been mixed. Things like, which measure was used, whether it was a clinical or a community sample, the ages, whether they looked at any mediating or moderating factors, things like that. What they conclude, Wardle and Cook, was that mediating and moderating factors are a big deal, and that the studies that looked at them tended to find an association between obesity and depression. The studies that didn't look at any mediating or moderating factors tended to not. So luckily for me, I have some mediating and moderating factors, so hopefully we'll be all right here. Putting all that together, though, all the studies that they looked at, the one conclusion they were able to draw was that adolescent white females emerge as a particular risk group. So putting all this together, I want to bring modified labeling theory together with a LifeCourse developmental perspective. And then I want to ask the question, does experiencing stigma at different developmental stages have a lasting impact on risk of depression? Okay, so here are my hypotheses. Earlier obesity will be associated with labeling by family and friends, and that labeling will be associated with later depression. So the idea is girls are obese, either family or friends or both are labeling them, and then that is going to trigger depression later on. The effects of, hypothesis 2, the effects of early labeling on later depression will be stronger when the labeling occurs during early adolescence compared to late childhood. The reason why I'm going with early adolescence compared to late childhood is because developmentally, if you look at the developmental literature, late childhood is considered kind of a more stable time, a more peaceful time, as opposed to entering into adolescence where, you know, kind of all hell breaks loose, and you've got a lot of changes going on, and it's a time of a lot of identity changing, identity shifting, identity formation. So I'm going to hypothesize at least that early adolescence is going to be, you know, kind of that critical period for when this is going to matter the most. Hypothesis 3 is the relationship between labeling and depression will be stronger for white girls compared to black girls. And hypothesis 4 is that labeling from parents will have more of a lasting impact than labeling from friends. And then I put in parentheses, or vice versa, because I don't have any theoretical reason for thinking one or the other on that one. In the developmental literature, in terms of who has more of an impact, parents or friends, there's kind of different perspectives on that, and different studies have found different things, and I didn't find either one compelling. So I figured for a hypothesis I should pick one, but I have no compelling reason to think, you know, that either will be stronger, but I'll be interested to see which one is. So the data for this study are from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute's Growth and Health Study. This Growth and Health Study was designed to examine the development of obesity in black and white adolescent females. They looked at cardiovascular things, environmental things, and psychosocial risk factors for disease. It's a fabulous, fabulous study. I had nothing to do with collecting the data, so I can say this. It is unbelievable because it has 10 years of data, and the sample size in the 10th year is almost exactly what it was in the first year. There is almost no attrition over 10 years. It's unbelievable. So we start with 2,379 females and end with something like 2218. They are ages 9 or 10 at baseline, and then there's 10 years of follow-up data. They did clinical data collection, and they did interview data collection, and these were at 1-year intervals. So starting at, they were either age 9 or 10 when it started, and then every year for 10 years. Sample was recruited from 3 clinical centers, so this is the only problem, is it's not like a national probability sample. It was recruited from 3 clinical centers: University of California, Berkeley, University of Cincinnati, Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and Westat Group Health Association in Rockville, Maryland. They used census data to locate tracts with equal numbers of black and white girls with minimal disparities between income and occupation. And this sample is about 50-50 white-black. All girls, no boys. So the time-varying variables that I'm looking at here. The first one is obesity, which is calculated from BMI using the CDC age and gender-specific cut points for 95th percentile. This was measured in all waves. It was measured by trained interviewers on a stadiometer. They weighed them twice and did their height twice, and if there was a discrepancy of more than a very, very small amount, then they did it a third time. So usually they averaged the 2 measurements, and they were done wearing a t-shirt and socks, you know, for consistency, so there's no clothing differences in the winter or anything like that. Between 12 and 16% of girls were obese at each time point. Parent labeling. Either mom or dad or both has told her she is too fat. So that is the question. Has your mother told you this year that you are too fat? Has your father told you you are too fat? This was only measured at baseline, wave 3, and wave 5. So baseline, they were 9 and 10. There was no wave 1. They just labeled it baseline, and then wave 2, wave 3. So wave 3, so baseline, they're 9 and 10. Wave 3, they are 11 and 12. And wave 4, they are, wave 5, I'm sorry, they are 13 and 14. If I look at the means, though, which is easier for me to remember, it's 10, 12, and 14. between 20 and 23% of subjects report parent labeling at each time point. The reason why that's higher than the obese measure is because some of the girls who were just overweight and not obese, their parents told them they were fat. So I also did this analysis over again, looking at those who were overweight and obese, and the findings are the same. So anyway, friend labeling, kind of same as the parent labeling: a female friend, a male friend, a best female friend, or a best male friend, or any combination thereof, has told her she is too fat in the past year. It's, again, measured at baseline, wave 3 and wave 5, when subjects were on average 10, 12, or 14. Between 21 and 25% of subjects report friend labeling at each time point. Depression is measured with the CESD scale, the Center, what does that stand for, CESD? Yes, that one. Okay, Center for Epidemiological Studies depression score. It's a 0 to 60 scale. 16 is considered clinically significant cut point for depression. I'm looking at it just as a scale from 0 to 60. This was measured only at waves 8 and 10, when subjects were on average 17 and 19. The time invariant variables I'm looking at are race, which is just a black or white, parent education at baseline, and family income at baseline. And these were, the parent education and the family income were assessed through the parent, not through the child. So to address these research questions, I used autoregressive mediation models. I'll show you a picture, because a picture is easier than putting up equations. But the idea with an autoregressive mediation model is it's a type of longitudinal model, but it's different than like a growth curve model or multi-level model. It allows me to model mediation at each time point, but it's autoregressive such that it adjusts for the effects of the variables at each time point on the others. So, like I said, a picture will be better for this. So, you know, obese at ages 13 to 14 is regressed on obese at ages 11 to 12, which is regressed on obese at ages 9 to 10. So it's controlling for the other obesity measures at each wave. And then same with the stigma. It's, you know, we have an arrow from stigma at 9 to 10 to 11 to 12 to 13 to 14, so that we are controlling for the effects of stigma across time. And that way we are able to isolate, you know, kind of at this wave, the effects of obese on stigma, and then the effects of stigma on depressive symptoms. Okay, so what this means then, so the autoregressive model, instead of, you know, kind of looking at this in terms of a trajectory or something like that, it's going to let me look at each time point, because what I'm interested in are those, you know, individual time points, those individual developmental periods. I'm basically doing a mediation model at each time point and then just controlling for the other time points. So the dotted lines here mean that I'm testing a mediating relationship. I'm also looking at the direct effects of stigma on depressive symptoms and the direct effects of obesity on depressive symptoms, but it would have been too many arrows to put that all in. So the idea is, you know, the main thing I'm looking at is the mediating relationship from obesity to the labeling variables to the depressive symptoms at age 16 and 17, and then at ages 18 and 19. So we can see kind of closer to these time periods, you know, so we've got, this ends at age 13 to 14. So then I'm looking, you know, just a couple years down the road at depression, and then a couple years later. So one in kind of mid-adolescence and then one in late adolescence, to see if the effects, you know, hold kind of shortly after, and then if they hold several years later. And then just for fun, I could not figure out how to do this in a picture, but I wanted to show that I'm doing those as separate models, but then I'm putting the depressive symptoms age 16, 17 into the model for 18 and 19 to see if there is an independent effect of stigma and labeling above and beyond the effect on depression at ages 16 and 17. Does that make sense? So I run it once without controlling for this, and then I run it once with putting that in to see what happens. Okay, so model results. I had planned to put these into a nice, pretty picture, but I'm not really good at pretty pictures, so that was the other pictures were the limit of what I could do. If any of you have ever run one of these types of models, it comes with lots and lots and lots and lots of output. Because what it gave me on the output is, let me go back up. It gives me one path for each of these. It gives me one path for each of these. It gives me one path for each of those. You know, anywhere you see an arrow, it gives me a number. Then the indirect effects are a second set of numbers. But so each individual thing is a regression parameter. So that can get to be kind of crazy. So I just took out the ones that I think tell the story the best. Yeah, sure.
Key question, what program and sort of package or command syntax do you use?
Yeah, I did this in M+.
And was this something you developed yourself, or I just haven't seen this before? So.
This comes from, do you know the McKinnon book on mediation models? Yeah. Great book. If you're interested in mediation analysis, he is the man. So he did a book. It's a couple years old, but fairly recent. And he does kind of from beginning to end starts with real basic, just cross-sectional mediation model with one mediator. Then same thing with two mediators. Then blah blah blah, and then moves into longitudinal. So this is from the longitudinal chapter. Autoregressive models are kind of considered. Like they're kind of looked down on compared to like mixed models, for example. But for this type of question, because I wanted to isolate the different time periods, it really made the most sense to do this. So there are limitations with an autoregressive model, but in this case, it answers the question the best. But so it comes from that book. And he does, in that book, this type of model with, you can either do it cross-lagged if you think you have, this is probably more of an answer than you want, but if you had some kind of phenomena where you believed obesity at 9 to 10 was influencing labeling at 11 to 12, and labeling at 11 to 12 was influencing obesity at 13 to 14, you could do a cross-lag model like that and test mediation that way. In my case, I just didn't think it made kind of intuitive sense that being obese at this time point should be leading to labeling at this time point, rather than a year later, because they may or may not still be obese a year later. So for me, I did a contemporaneous mediation model, but you can also do in this same framework, you could do a cross-lag model too. Okay, so what you're looking at here are regression parameters. And this is a linear model, because CSD was coded 0 to 60, so I just did it as a linear model. The key things I want to bring your attention to, so the ones at the top were the control variables, the demographics, not a single one of them is significant, so I shouldn't have even put them up here. We should just ignore them. Thing to note, this is in a simultaneous equation model, so I am testing the mediation at the same time that I'm testing the direct effects. So the first thing to note is that the obesity variables, this is obese at baseline, wave 3, wave 5, and wave 8. The obesity variables, none of them are significant in terms of their effects on CESD. But wait, that's okay. Hold on to that thought for a minute, and instead look at the labeling variables with me for a minute. So this is parent told them they were fat at baseline, parent told them they were fat when they were 12, parent told them they were fat when they were 14, and then this is the same for the friend variables. So what we notice is the variables at baseline when they are 9 and 10, the parent fat and the friend fat are not significant, but the parent fat and the friend fat at the next two, the early adolescent and the more mid-adolescent, are significant. And the size of the coefficient, this is the case that you can interpret it that since these are 0, 1 variables, having a friend tell you were fat when you were 14 years old is associated with an almost 3-point increase on the CESD. So that by itself is actually, it's a pretty sizable number, but it's also the case, of course, these are additive. If you had a parent tell you you were fat and a friend tell you you were fat at that age group, then you're looking at almost a 6-point increase on the CESD. And then if you had a parent tell you you were fat and a friend tell you you were fat at that time point and that time point, then look at how much higher your CESD score may be. So these are actually pretty sizable effects on CESD score. In terms of the indirect effects, Indirect effects are very hard to interpret. They're hard to explain. So I'm going to, even though I would chastise any of my students for doing this, I'm going to simplify it and just talk about what it means rather than interpreting the actual number. But if you look at the ones at the top, that you've got obesity. So I only put up the ones for wave 3 and wave 5 because the parent fat at baseline was not significant, so there can't be any mediation in those. So at wave 3, this is obesity going to friend fat going to CESD, for example, okay? We get a positive number here, and that is statistically significant at less than 0.001. So what this means by this being a positive number is you would kind of add that to the coefficient. And the other one, and what it means is that it is mediating the effects of obesity. So remember I said on the other slide that obesity was not significant? It is because the effect is being completely mediated by friend telling you you're fat and by parent telling you you're fat. So going back to what I said in the intro about how a lot of studies haven't found consistent relationships between obesity and depression, and that review is arguing that it had to do with mediators or moderators. Here's the example. Is that when we put it all together in a simultaneous equation model, we see that there is an effect of obesity, but it is completely mediated by labeling in this model at each time point. So here's obesity at time point 3 being mediated by friend telling you you're fat and parent telling you you're fat, and then here it is at wave 5, same thing. It kind of fell off the screen, it looks like, my number. They should have a number there, but completely mediated by, let me see if I can. Yeah, it's down here somewhere. Sorry about that.
That's over there, yeah.
Okay, wait a minute. Let's see. There it is. All right, so it's down there. It's 0.633, and that's 0.657. So they're actually very consistent, the amount that it's mediated by parent and the amount that it's mediated by friend. It seems to be about equal effects at both time points. Okay, and then this is, so that was on depression in wave 8, which is when they were like 17 years old. Okay, so then I run the same, this is actually in the same model because it's a simultaneous equation model, you can put all this in at the same time. So this is part of that same model, but this is the later depression. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm hoping I'm not too late in asking this question. In testing the mediation then too with the significance, is that based, what test is then that based on? Is that using like a modification of like the Symptomotology test and then like thinking like McKinnon's book and then like the posterior distribution, or is that?
Well, I'm using the built-in one in M+, okay. So I'm using the model indirect in M+, and that uses, it's not a Sobel, but it's an offshoot of I think it's the Santori-Bentler. It's in the McKinnon book though, but so it's the one that he recommends, but it's not the Sobel test. The Sobel test has kind of been.
You would sell in this, regardless of the Sobel test, using they say I know that it was argued that that's underpowered or whatever. Does M+ also take into account the asymptotic distribution?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a different standard error. It's a different calculation.
So these are pretty well powered then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's one of the things I like about M+ is I think they do this very well. They do the testing of the indirects very well, and they do testing of group differences very well too, in terms of staying up with kind of the latest and greatest. Okay, so again, this is still then in the same model, but it's a different piece of the same model. This is same set of independent variables, but looking at that later depression then. So this is depression when they are 19 and 20-ish. And if you look, it's essentially the exact same thing. None of the sociodemographics are significant. None of the obese variables are significant. The first parent fat and the first friend fat are not significant, but the second two parent fats and the second two friend fats are significant. And if you look at the size of the coefficient, it's exactly like what you would expect, that the later one has a smaller effect than the more recent one. In terms of comparing parent and friend, this one is slightly smaller than that one, but there's actually no statistically significant difference between those. So the parent variables and the friend variables have about equal, effect size or about equal impact. But so this follows the same pattern as the ones for the earlier measure. And if you compare the, kind of the sizes of the coefficients, so these are like, say, 1.7 and 3, 1.6 and 2.5. If you go back up and look at these 1.8 and 3, 1.6 and 2.7, there's no change over time. So at depression at age 17, depression at age 19, these are still having the same effects. And then that's, again, the same thing. I don't want to bore you to tears with numbers, but all it's showing is that the mediation is occurring, that the effects of obesity are being mediated by these labeling variables, that all these effects are significant, and that they're about the same size for parent and friend, they're about the same size. So they're kind of, it appears that parent labeling and friend labeling are having just about the same effect. Okay, and then the last one, so I put in CESD at wave 8 in the CESD wave 10 model to see if these things would continue to have an effect above and beyond their effect on the earlier time point depression. I didn't even put in the top panel because that stayed exactly the same. So this is just the bottom panel. A few things change. The p-value on pair fat goes down a little bit, so it's a little below 0.05 now, and the actual value of this has decreased. This one, the value has decreased, and actually all of them, the value has decreased a bit. So what that means then is that by putting in the earlier depression, it means that this is the amount they are operating above and beyond their effects on the earlier depression. So the earlier depression is causing the later depression because of these things, but then these things are continuing to exert an independent influence above and beyond their effect on the earlier depression. Does that make sense? A picture probably would have been better for that.
So it's cumulative.
What's that?
Basically, it's cumulative over
Right.
the 2 ways.
Right. So what, to kind of put it all together, what we found was that these things had an effect on this, they had an effect on this. But when we regressed, when we put in the arrow from here to here, this predicted this. All of these things predicted this, which predicted this. But all of those things continued to predict this, but smaller. So it was attenuated by its effects here, but then they also continued to have enduring effects themselves. Does that make sense? Okay.
Could you also tell how well actual BMI predicted the likelihood that the parent or the friend would actually label them fat?
Yeah, I have those parameters. They come out in the model too. I just didn't put them all in. Yeah, but that's very high.
What you would expect?
Yeah, I have very high, very high. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and skip the race findings. Okay, so the main research question was whether the experience of weight-based labeling during particular developmental periods of late childhood and early adolescence had lasting effects on later depressive symptoms. Those were the 4 hypotheses. I probably don't need to go over them again, so I will skip that. I found support for everything except the race hypothesis, but I'm skipping the race hypothesis, so we're not even going to talk about that right now. But these are kind of the conclusions, was that obesity was associated with fat labeling by parents and friends during early adolescence, but not late childhood. The labeling was associated with increased CESD scores in mid and late adolescence. The effects of late childhood and early adolescent obesity on later depression were completely mediated by parent and friend labeling. Parent labeling, oh, no, that one's not true. Forget that. They were even. labeling so the effects of parent labeling were about the same as the effects of friend labeling. And the labeling had stronger effects on depression among black girls compared to white girls, but we're not talking about those, so move on. Okay. Limitations, though. Implications and limitations. Implications first. It appears labeling has lasting consequences. It looks like, not from the early childhood one, but from the other two measures. If they were told they were fat by a friend, by a parent, that is continuing to have effects on them when they are 17 and when they are 19. It is continuing to impact their mental health. So it looks like the developmental stage at which youth experience labeling matters. That is, that there are critical periods of vulnerability for this type of stigma. The limitations of those, though, that we only examined labeling at 3 time points and depressive symptoms at 2. So what, of course, would be a beautiful test of this is, ideally in my ideal world, I would have had more measures of depressive symptoms in both directions. So what I would have liked is to be able to control for depressive symptoms early on, and then also to be able to look at this beyond age 19. Age 19 is nice, but I would have liked to look at this at 24 or at 30. I can't complain about this data set, though. Like I said, there's no attrition over 10 years. So they gave me they gave me everything they could in this. But in the future, that's what I would like. To me, the biggest weakness is not being able to control for mental health early on. Some of the studies about depression and obesity argue that it goes the other way, that depression leads to obesity. In terms of not being able to control for it, though, in this study, I don't think it makes or breaks it, because I don't think it changes the meaning if it was depression that caused the obesity early on. I don't think that changes anything. It's still, even if it was depression that caused the obesity is leading to the labeling, and the labeling is leading to further problems down the road. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a make or break it that we don't have it, but it would have been really nice to have it. And then it would have been nice also to see, instead of just at 3 time points, to see the labeling at more time points as well. One of the other limitations is that I only looked at labeling here. I didn't look at discrimination or poor treatment. Those are, have very big impact on people's psyche, on people's identity, and on these types of outcomes. So that would also be interesting, I think, to extend this and go beyond the labeling and look at discrimination or poor treatment or bias. Okay, so other limitations? I guess those are the only ones I listed. I'm sure there's more. All right, questions? And I'm totally open to ideas and feedback on this. What's that?
I'm going to let you handle your own question.
Okay, I will. Yes.
So I think it's really an interesting study of the relationship between obesity and depression. I'm just sort of also curious what, these sort of dynamics within the family, if you've got a parent labeling, the interaction of maybe a depressed parent as well, and sort of other dynamics within the family, then we know the outcome, with the kids, 3 times more likely, whatever, but they're much more likely to get depressed because there's so many social contexts in here, and part of the whole thing is the social interactions. And also, I'm not sure if you've said that or I missed it or whatever, that the adolescent depression increases, after puberty.
In girls.
In girls,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Was that accounted for in that population? Because we know that it increases generally. So, would that be accounted for in your sample? And how would that?
In terms of accounting for it, the 2 depression measures were both later. They were both, and one was 17 and one was 19. And so it's absolutely right that depression in girls tends to be very low until puberty and then goes up at puberty. In boys, it tends to be the opposite. But so I guess I'm not sure what you mean by accounting for it, because we weren't looking at change over time in depression.
No.
So
I'm just thinking because you sort of have the links between moderating effect of the parents and the labels and the friend and not obesity itself. And I'm just thinking, how about the natural confound, the biases of natural sort of community sample here? And you would have a tendency of an increase in depression as well. I'm just sort of
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's interesting that, yeah. Would you expect that increase we expect kind of across the board, though? Would we expect that to operate differently for obese and non-obese, though?
Yeah.
I guess would be the question.
Because you've taken a sample of only obese girls.
No, this is everybody.
Okay.
This is everybody.
Of course, if that's quite a huge sample. It's just things that I'm thinking.
Yeah.
out loud.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that I was thinking of when I was trying to think through the implications of not having the earlier measure, the earlier control of depression. But one of the things I thought of was depression is so low in girls at the start of the study anyway, because in that age group, depression doesn't go up until puberty in girls anyway. So I was kind of thinking maybe that helps me defend not having an earlier measure of depression. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Related to that, though, I mean, if they're following them, they're doing if they're doing exams with them, I mean, do you have anything else that you could use as a proxy for, even if it's like some sort of self-rated health measure that you know would be correlated to a certain extent with previous depression that you could use as some sort of theory?
It's a good question. I've been searching for something the past couple of weeks. I just found an anxiety measure that they took early on. And, anxiety and depression are fairly correlated, and so I'm wondering if I can use that, but I haven't cleaned it yet.
CSD does have, people have identified sort of anxiety, so subdomains with CSD symptoms, so there might be, if you can find, I don't know, maybe if you can break apart some of the measures at the later one and use that as a way to look at like sort of divergent, convergent validity that way, and create sort of a priori measure of depression.
Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good idea.
So this is really lovely. So if I understand the findings correctly, you very nicely show that the effect of obesity on depression, so something that's reasonably objectively defined, is almost completely mediated through labeling effects. But about half of all the girls were labeled fat by either their parents or their friends, but they wouldn't have met your definition of being obese. So what sort of conclusions can you make in terms of how this model would work for the girls that weren't actually obese but still were labeled fat?
Okay, two things. First of all, it's not the case that almost 50% were labeled, because there was a lot of overlap between that parent label and the friend label. So it was something like 21 to 23% were labeled by a parent, 21 to 25% were labeled by a friend. There's a lot of overlap in both of those.
Like about 12 to 16, okay, so maybe it's not 50%, but 12 to 16% actually met the definition of
for obesity, right. Okay, I see what you're saying. So what that is that for this one, I used obesity as the cutoff. Those girls that are being labeled fat who are not obese, the vast majority of them were in the overweight category. So I also ran these analyses with just overweight and above, or in 85th percentile and above. And so then that more kind of matches up better with, with the labeling. The results are exactly the same. But so now that I'm saying this to you, I'm thinking, maybe I should be presenting those results, because maybe that is more logical in terms of once you look at those, percentages. I was more interested in obesity than overweight, from the perspective that I thought kind of the more extreme status would be more stigmatized, would have, kind of more deleterious outcomes than just overweight, and especially now in the U.S. context where almost everybody's overweight now. So it seems to me like that will probably become less stigmatized. So that's why I was focusing on obesity. But from the perspective of labeling, it may make more sense to do both together.
Is there a sample of the population that had been labeled as obese in, say, like as 14-year-old, but not, and then didn't report 2 years later? And if so, what was the sort of result on their depression or CBD scores?
So that's interesting. In the first study, we did kind of the model I used is a group-based trajectory model where it looks at kind of distinct trajectories of, say, obesity over time. And I found that there was, a group that was never obese, there was a group that was chronically obese, a group that was kind of increased, was normal weight when they were kids and then increased at puberty, and then a group that was heavy as kids and then kind of thinned out at puberty. So in that analysis, like what I was looking at was that change. I was looking at like of those girls that lost weight, what happened to their self-esteem. In this one, essentially the question was whether or not they lose weight. What happens? What's the impact of these experiences early on depression later on, whether or not they lose weight. So in this analysis, I didn't really care about that. I could try to separate them out and look and see what happens, but that's not what I did. What I did here was I just controlled for it at every stage. So that's essentially saying, if everybody was the same on this at this wave, how is it affecting them?
I understand that. I'm just wondering because your sort of original question, as far as I understood it, was, if you have the sort of stigmatizing event and someone actually falls out of that stigmatizing event, what are the effects, right? And so so that's where my question was coming from, because it seemed like that would, in some ways, have more to say to that original question that I understood you having than.
Yeah, that was the question from the. That was the question from the first paper, and then in this one, this was supposed to be about like the timing of it. But it would be interesting, I think, in this one to kind of look at that trajectory of girls and see, in particular, what happens to them. But again, for me, I was mostly just looking at the timing of it on this one, so it didn't really matter as much if they stay in the status or if they leave the status or whatever happens to them. It kind of didn't matter. It just had to do with the timing of the early experiences.
I'm building on that question actually, because it seems to me it's sort of you kind of got a neat interplay. It's kind of like the interface of two disciplines in a way. So from this standpoint of sort of bringing like I'm going to bring a Bruce Link term into this. Actually, ironically, you're using this. So like bring more of like an epidemiological sociology, as he would term it, sort of thing of taking the word thing. Or Bruce, who tends to use Bane a lot. So this is sort of funny that I'm now doing this. Where he takes taking a theory, a sociological theory, and applying it here and looking at something and some sort of epidemiological sort of mechanism.
Yeah.
But it seems to me also the interplay kind of going backwards in terms of thinking about this in sort of like thinking about it in a fundamentally sociological kind of way is that sort of dynamic process here. So you were saying, you were less concerned about, were they just ever labeled? That was the big concern and what was sort of the outcome. What's sort of interesting here is that I think you might be able to do it with the data is kind of see the interplay, which then informs stigma theory in a way of seeing here of is being labeled in depression as one of the intermediate mechanisms, the idea about the social control normative aspect of it, of weight loss too. And I'm trying to think through that way of now you're responding to the group. Here's something that's stigmatizing but potentially modifiable, unlike certain other conditions. And so, what does that actually mean for stigma in terms of how stigma works out and thinking about it at this like critical developmental point?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it. I mean, in some ways, maybe it could take you 8 steps afar from this current study. But in some ways, and of course, I don't know the data like you do and what's in it. But it seems to me that that's also kind of where you could be looking at sort of these, making sorts of quasi-experimental sort of assertions, and then if it goes this way, we would expect we should expect this based on that, and I think which ties.
Yeah, which ties into
what I'm saying, but and also links your two studies together in a sense too. So is depression or is obesity essentially bad for depression in a sense of because you're being labeled, but also getting at the context of that. Is it also because maybe I'm trying to modify something where I can't, or can that actually be looked at with the data because you have multiple waves?
So when I started this, I wanted to first do this the way that I did the other one. my question on this one was really about the timing and not as much about what happens when you leave the status. But my starting point was to do this like I did the other studies. So I ran the group-based mixture model to get the trajectories, and then I wanted to regress the depression outcomes on those trajectories and see, if it kind of is a first step. The problem is that those groups are very small. So 75% or so of the kids in the sample are chronically normal weight range. The second highest group is the chronically obese. So of those two that are changing, the ones that are losing weight and the ones that are gaining weight, they're both about 7% of the sample. So it's a very small group, which was a power limitation in the first paper, but the first paper was looking at self-esteem, which was measured at every single wave. And so that gave me a boost in terms of power. In this context, it was harder to do that with the depression only measured into the future. So that's one of those things that, hearing you guys talk, I'm thinking, yeah, that'd be cool if I could figure out a way to look at that. So I'm gonna have to think about what you guys said and see if I can figure out a way to make that work, because it would, it would kind of extend and kind of relate what I've done here with the other one. So I like it.
I've got one other just quick question. It's actually, I guess, for all of our benefit. Can you tell us really quickly again, what did you find by race? So this was...
Okay. Yeah, so race, I thought, I have those findings. I can pull them up. I just thought the talk would go on forever if I did those. So I ran this all with the combined sample. In the previous paper, what I found was that the self-esteem, staying low only happened in white girls. In black girls, it bounced back up. So it looked like, in terms of, the lingering effects of stigma, which is what I'm calling it, that it lingered only in white females and not in black females. So that's what I was expecting here. I was expecting that, to find this depression effect and this labeling effect for white girls and not for black girls. Because if black girls are, kind of have their own definitions of, body and whatever, then the labeling shouldn't have that much of an effect. What I found was they were actually exactly the same. The black girls were slightly higher, but then when I tested it, it wasn't significant. So they were exactly the same. The black girls were impacted the same as the white girls. And so I was thrown by that, what does that mean? That I was expecting totally the opposite. So, I did a little digging around in the literature this week, and I found a couple studies that showed that while it is true that black girls are differentially impacted in terms of things like self-esteem from obesity, these studies argued that once you bring labeling and teasing into it, that all bets are off, all racial differences are off, that it may be that, off on their own, they're defining, body in a different way such that, just being obese isn't impacting their self-esteem. But if somebody's calling you fat, if somebody's, giving you a label, if somebody's teasing you, that impacts black girls as much as it impacts white girls. So that was kind of the explanation the only potential explanation I could come up with. Or unless it's just kind of like a cumulative disadvantage or double jeopardy kind of thing, that, stigma from being black and then stigma from being obese and then being teased. And if they're being teased about their weight, they might also be being teased about their race. And I don't know.
Or a Moffley network composition argument too.
I'm sorry?
Or a Moffley network composition argument too, in terms of cross-cultural, so do they hang out with more white girls?
Yeah, I don't know. I know that from the way they said the sample was drawn, they chose census tracts with equal numbers of black and white, kids. So my guess is they're actually probably pretty integrated, but I don't know.
One wonders if that could bias you towards a null in finding the race difference.
Yeah.
There's pure...
Yeah. The other thing, and I should have put this in the shortcomings, the other thing here is that, literally the text of the question was, has your mother told you you're too fat? Has your father told you you're too fat? Has your best friend told you you're too fat? There's a big difference between your mom kind of sitting down with you very compassionately and saying, honey, I think you're too fat. versus, your mom saying, like degrading you and putting you down. And so we don't really know the context here of, when you say that your mom told you you're too fat, what was the tone of her voice? I wish we could kind of get it that, because there's very different ways that this could be going on. In terms of labeling theory, it doesn't matter though, because labeling theory would say even the doctor just telling you, you meet the criteria for obesity, that's enough to kind of flip that switch. You're now an obese person, let the internalization begin. So from that perspective, it doesn't really matter their tone of voice or who's saying it or whatever. But but developmentally and all that, I would think that could make a difference too, is the context in which the insults are being hurled.
I'm just wondering if you had a variable that spoke to their own body satisfaction or their self-label, and whether there were some girls whom they could be told by their mom or their friend and they still had an okay sense of body satisfaction, whether self-label matters.
So we didn't have a measure of body satisfaction. What we had was a measure of perceived body size. So that was, what we used in the first study. That I didn't think was as applicable here. But body satisfaction would be a great variable.
And like, just from your thoughts of the literature, is there any evidence that some girls are sort of more resilient in a way?
Oh yeah, there's this whole literature on kind of, that one of the sentences in here, one of my vague sentences that I can't stand, is that people are stigmatized to varying degrees. But the reason why I put that in there is because some people are very able to resist, to have the stigmatizing condition and not succumb to the stigma. And it's because there's kind of resistance tactics, and there's some that are very active resistance tactics, and then there's some that are, just kind of passive resistance tactics, and they have to do with self-acceptance or, alternative views on things, or, some of them are very active, like not identifying with other obese people so that you don't see yourself as part of that group, or things like that. But so yeah, I think how people see themselves absolutely would affect to what degree they are stigmatized, or to what degree they feel stigmatized by that.
I'm trying to think, even in the down the road applications, we're now doing some work in Vancouver schools and thinking about what would this mean from a health education standpoint. What are the messages you actually want to give to girls, and are there lessons that can be learned here about how we talk about these things?
Well, that's what that's why I was interested in. So in the first one, what I was hoping was to get, kind of get the message across that it's not enough to lose weight. Like, people's psyche is still damaged from having been stigmatized. And so even though they lose the weight, they still don't feel good about themselves. And so that was kind of what I thought was like a public health message there, was that if we get that message out that it's not enough to just lose weight, you still have to kind of, heal from it in that sense to get your, your sense of self back. In this one, I think, in trying to identify, so that was, one of the, kind of the impetus for this one was I wanted to find out along those lines, when is this most important? Like, when is this most detrimental? When do we most have to worry about these girls experiencing this stuff?
This was even a concern for us because we're about to do a survey with grade 7 and 8 students, and we were trying to decide, well, should we even measure BMI?
Yeah.
And we decided not to, and we're going to have them self-report, but even by researching them, we are labelers.
Yeah.
And we don't want to create the stigma in attempting to do the research to inform the practice. And that's a tricky thing. I mean, you want to get the data. I mean, it'd be interesting to know what, they measure it every year.
Yeah.
Did just the measuring impact some of these factors?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. It depends if if they even have a context of how to, put it together. And I don't know. I don't know what people, what girls that age, like what the weight numbers mean to them.
I wonder, even when they completed the study, do they get their BMI scores after they weigh in? Or, I've seen some of these studies where they sort of turn their back and they don't find out.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting, is there's a big movement right now in doctors' offices. So when I submitted the first paper for review, one of the comments I got back was, using the definition obese. That there's a big movement in the U.S. to move away from using the word obese with kids because it's damaging, because it's stigmatizing. And so they want to just use They want to switch the 95th percentile to overweight and the 85th to at risk for overweight. I'm okay with that. I still use these words in the paper because I feel like I'm not in a clinical setting. I'm not talking to teenage girls. As far as the CDC is concerned, being the 95th percentile, you're obese. In terms of health problems, you're obese at that size. So that's why I continue to use those terms. If I was in a clinical setting, I would probably change the way I talked.
It's tricky. I mean, even the measuring is loaded.
Yeah, even the terms are loaded.
Well, I think we're all out of time.
All right.
If we could all, you could join me.